Listen up. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed in this podcast belong solely to the podcast participants, and not to any participant's employer, organization, committee, or other group or individual. This podcast is for entertainment purposes only. You know, for fun. So lighten up and enjoy. Hello, Stomping Jen.
Hi.
Welcome to the Soft Serve podcast.
Oh, thanks for having me. I so enjoy being here.
Thanks for
with
being
you
here.
Every week.
And I, of course, am Sawtooth Frank, and I'm really excited for this episode. We have a guest on this week, an anthropologist, to talk to us about a program going on here in our home state of Massachusetts called the iShape program. And it's really about bringing awareness to Indigenous peoples and Indigenous cultures, and I'm really excited to have this conversation. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Are you excited?
Let's do it.
All right. So, and that anthropologist's name is Virginia McLaurin, and we're going to talk to her right on the other side of our intro music.
Great.
Okay?
Yes.
All right.
All
Here
right.
we go. Whoops.
The Soft Serve Podcast.
Creamy, delicious ideas without the creepy truck. All right, Stomping Jen.
Yes.
You may have heard that again. I changed all of my buttons
I think
around.
you need to reorder your buttons.
Or I need to have a practice session. Just sit here all day, one
until
day,
it becomes like rote.
blindfold myself, and just
That's right.
hit buttons till I get it right.
I have a story about a button, about a soundboard.
You do?
Yeah, but I want to talk to Virginia first.
Okay, well, let's say hi to Virginia. Virginia, thank you, Virginia McLaurin, an anthropologist, who is... Well, why don't you tell us about your work in anthropology and who you are, and just tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Well, hi. Thank you for having me on the show today. As you said, I'm an anthropologist finishing a PhD at UMass Amherst, and my work really focuses on Indigenous people and how they're portrayed in the media, by media that they create themselves, and kind of more mainstream media that Indigenous people mostly don't have a hand in creating. And so I've become involved with this project, iShape Massachusetts, that I'm very excited about. And it really relates to raising awareness about Indigenous communities in the Northeast and in Massachusetts in particular.
Thanks. And can you tell us a little bit more about what the iShape project is? Like what what spaces does it occupy? What are its objectives, and how did you as an anthropologist get involved with it?
Absolutely. So iShape Massachusetts actually stands for Indigenous Scavenger Hunt for Activism, Preservation, and Education in Massachusetts. And I kind of heard about this group putting it on, the Belchertown Justice Collaborative. It's a group of young people who have gotten involved in a lot of social justice issues in Belchertown, including things like police violence, implicit bias, cultural appropriation. So they're dealing with a lot of different communities and trying to really bring people together and raise awareness around a lot of issues. So they wanted to do this project in the fall where they focus mostly on Indigenous issues for kind of the 6-week run. And keeping in mind that COVID still has us all pretty housebound, they wanted to do something that was accessible virtually, that people both inside the Belchertown community and outside of it could potentially make use of. That would address a huge range of ages for people to get involved. So I heard about it kind of through word of mouth from some other people who kind of passed along emails and said, hey, do you know this group? I myself used to live in Belchertown for 2 years. And when I was there, this group wasn't a thing yet, but I was super happy to hear that this was going on in my former hometown. So I just kind of started sending emails and said, I'd love to be involved. I'd love to help put this together. We drew in some other Indigenous people from the area. And then we just kind of started building this huge kind of database of resources for different age ranges.
Now, I wanted to ask this. You have you're doing anthropology work involving Indigenous people. You're involved in the iShape program. Do you have Indigenous ancestry? Or do you have a personal involvement in these topics and areas?
Yes, I do. So I'm originally from Georgia, and my family is from the lower Appalachian area. And so I'm of Eastern Cherokee and Scottish descent. And there was a lot of intermarriage there between kind of people of the Celtic diaspora and Cherokee people. So I'm Wolf Clan. My partner is also of Cherokee descent and is Bird Clan. So from an early age, I was really interested in Indigenous issues and really wanted to do something in my future career around that. For a while, I considered going into law, but having taken one law class kind of disabused me of that idea forever.
Yeah.
So I started taking other classes, found anthropology, and actually ended up in an African studies class. But the professor was using anthropology as a way to basically do good social justice activism in the communities that he was involved with. And I kind of realized if I could do the same thing, but with Indigenous communities, that would basically be what I had kind of wanted to do for my whole life.
Yeah. I think just one more question about your personal background. Did you grow up knowing that you had Cherokee ancestry, or was that something you found out later, or as some people do? Or is that something you kind of knew about as you were growing up, and was it kind of part of your identity as a young person and then into kind of adulthood?
So it's something that I always knew growing up.
Yep.
It was a big part of our family culture. At the same time, we lived in some very rural areas, and there often weren't a lot of Indigenous community members to connect with. Although we did make a point to go to local powwows, we actually returned to Cherokee, North Carolina every year or other year to kind of reconnect. And so my family could make sure that I was getting a little bit of that cultural background. My mom, who is not Indigenous at all, was actually one of the biggest kind of supporters of making sure that I had some kind of connection. But it's interesting because looking at me, a lot of people did not necessarily see a Native American person. Looking at my dad, it's a little bit clearer to them, although typically if it's not pointed out that he's of Native ancestry, people would guess probably Latinx if they saw him. And my mom is the palest human being that you've ever seen. So I came out very pale and took after her in a lot of ways. But yeah, looking at our family, most people would guess that there was, either Latinx or Native American heritage there, just looking at my father, but not necessarily if they just saw me. So I was also interested in that growing up. I knew I had Indigenous ancestry, and yet I would go to school and teachers didn't necessarily look at me and see that. And we would hear these lessons about, how the Cherokee all died on the Trail of Tears. And I'm thinking, well, they definitely didn't.
Right.
I know for sure they didn't.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for sharing that with us. I was definitely kind of interested in what your personal involvement with the topic was. The iShape program, is that something that is that takes place across the country, or is that just happens here in Massachusetts? Or is it kind of a national program brought together and put on by groups like the Belchertown Justice Collaborative?
So this is it's entirely the brainchild of the Belchertown Justice Collaborative. And I would actually love for it to be more of a national project. I think it's something that other towns could easily take on, maybe even adapt to their own local Indigenous communities, feature artists from their communities, feature books written by community members that are close to them in the way that we've kind of structured this. But this is entirely from the minds of these incredible young people working in Belchertown.
Yeah, and they are impressive. We had them on a previous episode of our podcast back in the summer, and I was blown away by their thoughtfulness, their maturity, and their ability to plan something and carry it out with the utmost highest levels of professionalism.
Yeah.
They were just amazing. And when I think about the name iShape, I like it from an acronym point of view, right? But I like the name also in terms of what it suggests, right? Is my own education can kind of begin to help maybe shape some of my own narratives about Indigenous people and history here in North America, and also with my own education, maybe I can help shape kind of the larger narrative and conversation around these topics. So I love the name. It's brilliant, actually. As I sit there and think about it.
Yeah.
So
I feel the same way.
Yeah. So
I was
please.
just going to say, when I think about it, I think about, what the shape of the future is going to look like for like Indigenous kids growing up, and that they won't have to go through some of the same things and some of the same erroneous assumptions that Indigenous kids today or 10 years ago had to go through, because people are going to be better educated.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And the campaign, the iShape program, it's a multi-week kind of educational endeavor, and it started a few weeks back around October 12th, I believe, 2020, and it goes through November 27th, 2020. Can you talk to us a little bit about kind of the different weeks of the program, and to whatever level of detail you're comfortable with or want to go into, kind of just walk us through what the program looks like across those weeks?
Absolutely. So it started off with Columbus Day and Indigenous Peoples Day. They are the same day right now. And of course, there's this big shift to kind of move away from Columbus Day and towards Indigenous Peoples Day. And so we wanted to really start there because the fall has a lot of events that are really relevant to the way Native people are viewed by the rest of society. So Indigenous Peoples Day is the kickoff. It's kind of meant to explain why there's this big movement away from Columbus Day and the negative history associated with Columbus. Then we kind of moved on through different weeks where we looked at kind of a new subject every week. So we looked at mascots and how it's important for Indigenous people to tell their own stories and not have other people define them in another week. We have 2 weeks that are just dedicated entirely towards environmentalism, because it's such a huge issue for Indigenous communities right now, but also for, I think, everyone in the whole world, to really consider how to bring values like the ones many Indigenous communities have of respect for nature into contemporary practice and, popular culture. We need to popularize respect for nature. And then we kind of ended it with a couple of weeks on Thanksgiving, because you have Thanksgiving, the national holiday that we recognize that often has some erroneous assumptions about Indigenous people woven into that narrative. And then you have traditional Thanksgivings, which many Native nations still celebrate, often 13 a year, different types of Thanksgiving. And so we wanted to really parse out the difference between those two and also what they have in common.
I never even knew there was another Thanksgiving.
Yeah, and I have some. Well, I have
Sorry.
actually. No. Neither did I. And I just took a note about that because I actually have some questions about Thanksgiving a little bit later. I wanted to ask, when I was on the website looking, I saw that the materials are kind of stratified by age group, which I thought is brilliant, right? Because it doesn't limit the program to just one group of people, right? It's really aimed at kind of meeting learners maybe where they're at, right? I'm working my way right now through Howard Zinn's People's History of America, right? And some of the stuff in that probably you don't want to put in front of a 5-year-old. So I really valued that the program is thought out in that way, that there really is almost something for everybody in the community, regardless of their age. So I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the thought that went behind that and the kind of maybe approach that might be taken for different age groups.
Absolutely. So there's a Quinawampanoag woman, Linda Coombs, who talks about what she calls a spiraling theory of education. And a lot of times parents who know a little bit about Native American history might think, this is too sad, too violent, too brutal to even begin to talk about it with my 5-year-old. And that's an understandable fear. You definitely don't want to sit your 5-year-old down to this documentary that really details the graphic violence that befell the Taino people when Columbus landed. You really don't want to introduce them to that level of detail. But it also means you don't have to lie to them and say he was great and he got along with the people there and it was so friendly. You can build slowly at an age-appropriate level so that you can start with exercises like telling children, Columbus took people from his homes. That was probably very sad for them. So they don't feel lied to, because often when kids get to the college age or even high school, they'll look back and say, well, you told me all of these things about Columbus or about Thanksgiving Day. Now I'm learning almost the complete opposite. So there's no need to do that, to kind of teach kids and then unteach them. We can build up. And hopefully with this project, parents feel comfortable enough to sit their kids down to some of these materials without, having to assume that something terrible is going to pop out in the middle of this 5-minute video that they're sitting them down to, that's going to scar this poor kid for life. So we've thoroughly looked through all of these resources. And if there was anything even questionable, even, spooky stories that involve ghosts, we put that in parentheses saying, oh, hey, for the really little kids, this might be a little spooky. There's ghosts or there's a werewolf in this story, so be careful. So it should hopefully make everyone feel really comfortable with this learning.
Yeah, and so I think since we've just recently passed it, I'm thinking about Columbus Day and, the reframing it as Indigenous Peoples Day. I like to actually think of it as reclaiming it in my mind. But could you talk a little bit about why that's so important that we take a holiday like Columbus Day, take a figure like Columbus, and try to think about it differently, and not just from a white Eurocentric point of view?
Absolutely. So when I was a kid growing up and seeing the rest of the nation celebrate Columbus Day, it really drove home for me that my ancestors were not important, because they were hurt by this man who everyone was celebrating. And when we really look at the history of Columbus, we see that it's not just Indigenous people who he hurt. His men targeted young girls for sexual trafficking. So there was, children being attacked, women in particular being attacked, Indigenous people being attacked. He also was kind of the mind behind the transatlantic slave trade. So you have that negative history associated with him. He was extremely anti-Semitic, extremely anti-Muslim. So there's a lot of groups of people that he kind of virulently attacked during his lifetime. And celebrating a man like that kind of tells you that those people and the attacks on those people are not important, not enough to get upset about, to not have a holiday for this person. So that all sounds very sad, but what I will say is that the fact that there's even discussion about changing it is something that I never ever thought would happen in my lifetime growing up. I just thought Native Americans are too small a group for anyone to care about how we feel about this holiday or really anything else. And I'm so proud to see that changing, that people actually are starting to care.
Yeah. I struggle with this. Like, is it as simple as kind of what I see as the false narrative of Columbus's heroism and his bold discovery? Is it as simple as it's just that, white people wrote these history books and that is the story they wanted to tell? Because when as I'm working my way through Howard Zinn's People's History of America, like, it's clear to me there's so much documentation
that he was an awful person.
Yeah, available, like first-hand documentation about what Columbus really did, and that there could be, or there should have been, more objective kind of reporting of that. so I guess if do you have any insight into how these misrepresentations of history get made, and how how the real story just gets shoved into the closet and stuck there until maybe somebody comes along and publishes a book that, like Howard Zinn's, that kind of turns the world on its head a little bit.
Absolutely. I think the original, Columbus's hero myth is very much a European perspective, and a European perspective from a completely different era. So if you're a European person in the 1500s, it's great that Columbus landed in this place, because now you have servants and slaves, you have all the resources exploited from this place. And that's a very particular class and time period and geographical perspective. How that gets passed down, I think, is largely in school systems and popular culture, where you have a lot of people watching these little cartoons about how heroic he was. It's in the school books, and it just gets repeated kind of ad infinitum. And a lot of people, even though the evidence is clearly out there, we've got letters from Columbus, we've got letters from friends like Michelle de Cuneo, who writes a very graphic account of what he did to one of the women that Columbus gifted him. People don't know about these. They're out there, but you have to search for them.
Right.
And it's not really made readily available to you within the school system at any level.
Right.
So there's still many teachers who don't know about this, and many who don't know that even Native Americans are still alive and around in the United States.
Are there enduring kind of firsthand accounts from Indigenous people and other Native Americans about what Columbus did? Because I'm thinking to myself, here I am giving credit to Howard Zinn for telling this story, but I'm sure, Indigenous people have been telling this story way before Howard Zinn did, about what Columbus really did. So I'm curious, if there are oral traditions, written histories about Columbus and what he did here in the Americas.
There are absolutely still some oral traditions that have been passed down through the Taino and Carib peoples. And there are kind of generational stories about what Columbus did and the lasting effects. Although I will say they were really disrupted by Columbus's own actions, because that system relies on elders kind of passing these stories down to children. And of course, many people died, and that whole system of transmission was completely disrupted by Columbus's arrival. There are also some interesting secondhand accounts from Indigenous people that were written down by Europeans. So one man in particular, Bartolomé de las Casas, wrote down a lot of firsthand accounts of just the Spanish in general and what they were doing as conquistadors as they came over, and supposedly were there to help these Indigenous people convert to Catholicism and reorient their societies, but in fact were taking advantage of them the vast majority of the time. So de las Casas wrote up this history, and it included some accounts from Indigenous people, as he ended up ultimately allying with them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so I think about enduring tales that may be myths, and we're coming up on Thanksgiving, and we were just talking about that a few minutes ago. And you mentioned that there are, I think, traditional Indigenous observances of Thanksgiving all across, I think, North America. Could you talk a little bit about that?
So many tribal nations still have Thanksgivings, and sometimes they're even monthly or associated with moon cycles. So there could be 13 in 1 year, right? So if you go down to Mohegan in Connecticut, they will have a strawberry Thanksgiving in the summer. There's kind of a winter Thanksgiving that's celebrated locally called Nakomo. And the student group at UMass actually generally celebrates Nakomo kind of right in the middle of exams every year. So it varies from place to place, and how many of them varies from group to group. But generally, the act of giving thanks is a fairly shared feature across a lot of Indigenous groups. And this Thanksgiving that we know of as the first Thanksgiving may have had some ties to that general practice, but fundamentally does not have the same religious or spiritual elements that I think were there when Indigenous people were celebrating it. Not for everyone present, at least.
Now, when we think about the traditional Thanksgiving, is there a more kind of historically accurate or culturally sensitive way to think about it from a Indigenous people's perspective?
Well, this is a personal view on it, and other Indigenous people may disagree, of course, but I think emphasizing the land and what the land has given. I think that we all kind of celebrate Thanksgiving with a sense of thankfulness, which is nice, right? We're thankful for what we have, for our family, and that's certainly part of traditional ones as well. But I think we've all become a little disconnected from where the food comes from. We have this bounty of food on our Thanksgiving, our kind of popular culture Thanksgiving, and we don't think about who grew the food, the land that the food came from, how the food was shipped to us, as we don't think about those things on a daily basis. But I think for Indigenous people, a focus on the landscape and the ecology that gives you that food and really taking care of that is pretty central to every Thanksgiving celebration.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Just because, like here in the Pioneer Valley where we're living right now, there's such an emphasis on buy local, and, there's a lot of farm shares around, and you can buy a lot of local produce and meats and dairy. You can pretty much get almost everything.
Yeah.
Nowadays, local, being locally produced. And I don't know what I'm trying to say here, except for that concept of being connected to the land, was sort of had more of a resurgence in the last couple of decades, I want to say.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly one way to think about the land, right, and the ecology a little more deeply. One thing that came to my mind, and maybe it's a little too simplistic, is maybe just go for a walk on Thanksgiving Day. Like get out there, take a walk through the landscape. Like,
not just play football or watch a football game.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Do you, Virginia, do you have any suggestions about how people maybe can be more mindful about that connection to the land and in relation to Thanksgiving and what it provided the people at that time?
Absolutely. I love the idea of taking a walk through the landscape and being mindful, not just talking on the walk, but really taking note of the land around you. I think the more we can learn about the plants that are around us, and I'm guilty of this as well, I can walk through my front yard and not recognize some of the plants there. Yeah. I don't know what they are, what they do, if they would be safe to eat. Do they have medicinal properties? I'm working on learning it, but there's so many plants. And if you take a walk and you really start to look at them, there's a good chance most of us will not know most of the plants that we see or what they do. So I think, maybe picking up on learning a little bit of that, and then noticing the animals around as well. Yeah. A lot of Indigenous prayers you'll hear acknowledge the ones that crawl, the ones that fly, the ones that swim, the two-leggeds and the four-leggeds. So it's acknowledging the fact that we share this planet with other creatures who are as meaningful as we are in many ways. So I think taking note of the animals around as well.
Yeah. And just as a matter, I probably already have revealed my opinion on this, but I'm one who fully supports kind of reframing some of these holidays to be more historically and anthropologically accurate. And one of the things I've gotten is pushback from people that I'm trying to rewrite history, or how do we counter those claims that by trying to
right the wrongs in the textbooks,
or even just accurately represent Indigenous people in reframing some of these holidays like Columbus Day and thinking about Thanksgiving a little more deeply. How do we push back against these claims that we're trying to rewrite history?
I think we have to do it with evidence.
Yeah.
I might be a little naively hopeful here, but I think when you have this preponderance of evidence and you can say, no, actually the creation of Columbus Day is itself a rewriting of history. Here's the real historical documents we have. I think that's the most powerful argument we have. Other than that, it's just, arguing facts against ideals.
Mm-hmm.
And at that point, it becomes not really a debate or an argument anymore. You have facts and the other person has this idea of history that they are going to hold on to no matter what. But I also think we can acknowledge the place that Columbus Day had for Italian Americans, that at the time it was a way for them to feel proud when they were a group that was persecuted in the United States. And we can say, well, it's nice that for them they had that. Here's what it did to Indigenous people. And at this point, Indigenous people really probably need to be rid of Columbus Day more than Italian Americans need it to validate their presence here, which I think has been validated through the last century. I'm certainly not against Italian Americans having pride in their history in this country either. So I think we can acknowledge what it does for some people in terms of giving them pride in their ancestry, while saying, at this point, it might be doing more damage than good on the whole. And it really is inaccurate. It's not an accurate representation of Columbus that we have out there in popular culture. And shouldn't we strive for accuracy?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think so. And, I think there's danger in creating false myths about people, right? Especially historical figures. And I mean, we're all human and we all have flaws, right? And I mean, I think what Columbus did transcends flaws, right? But what I'm saying is, I think it's important to really try to see people in their time, in their place, and look at their behavior in terms of as Virginia is saying, in terms of the documented evidence, and try to reckon with that.
Yeah. Sorry.
What are you thinking?
I'm just,
seem like you're grabbing onto something there.
Wrapping my head around this society that we live in, that people just really don't want to give up on these ideas that they have, ingrained in them, or, believe in, or even when faced with evidence, they dismiss. It's been a very difficult, challenging year in that regard.
Yeah.
So, having this conversation in the midst of all of that is just, it's just hard and it's tiring. And I can imagine for Indigenous people that it's a lifelong feeling. And just the empathy and the sympathizing and the, it's overwhelming. It's just, frankly, just very overwhelming.
Yeah. Well, so thinking about history and present day, a question I have for you, Virginia, is if you could talk about why it's so important that we connect the history of Indigenous cultures to the present day life of Indigenous people in our communities, not just here, but, across North America.
Absolutely. I think if you look at the history of what Indigenous people have been through, both personally as individuals and as a whole group in the United States, and there's a lot of variation between Indigenous cultures, of course, but there is this shared experience of being labeled Native American, the shared experience of what the government has, demanded of us at different times and put upon us at different times, what popular culture has represented all of us as. I think it completely tells you about some of the issues that are going on today, some of the land issues, some of the ways that things get misrepresented in mass media. So if we look at something like, the Mashpee Wampanoag trying to reclaim some of their lands in the 1970s, and the way that people became afraid that the Mashpee were actually trying to take the land that their houses were on, these families with private property. They weren't at all trying to do that. They were just trying to take back land that had been illegally taken from them and seized from them against Massachusetts' own state laws, and say, okay, whatever hasn't been sold to private families, we would like to have back, and we're going to make it a reserve. Mm-hmm. So they were doing something ecologically sound, preserving this very rare, ecology out on the Cape, We're not trying to take people's homes, and yet it became this terrible fear of them, that they were going to come and evict families from their houses and toss them out onto the lawn. So the way we're portrayed in the past as these unreasonable, savage people determines how we're portrayed now, even when very reasonable things are asked for, like please don't put a pipeline under a very major water supply, right? That we actually do have the rights to. I'm thinking, of course, about Standing Rock from a few years ago. A very reasonable, very sound argument that gets reframed as these wild, out of control activists, Native Americans, right? So there's all kinds of historical issues for why the land rights get trampled on, and why when Native Americans do ask for those rights to be respected, it gets completely framed incorrectly, inaccurately, and kind of hysterically sometimes in mass media. So I think we have to correct some of the assumptions about us and some of the stereotypes about us to even be recognized. And another aspect of that is that if people look at you and you don't fit their idea of what a Native American is supposed to look like, then why would they ever give you a voice in politics?
Right.
Because you don't exist to them.
Yeah. And I'm just kind of sitting with some of the examples you brought up of contemporary issues that Native Americans are dealing with. And I think that some people, non-Indigenous members of our country might not even be aware that a lot of these issues are still going on, right? And also, I'm just like, in Stomping Jen, you mentioned current events. I'm thinking about COVID-19 and the disproportionate impact that disease had on certain Indigenous populations. And so there's, like, for me, like, there's the issue around awareness that that Indigenous people in the United States still are dealing with very serious legal and social issues. And that's why we need a program like iShape, to encourage activism and Indigenous rights and sovereignty. And so I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit more about that kind of activism piece around awareness and encouraging people to get involved and help out.
Yeah, I think in the past, it's been difficult for Indigenous people to find a lot of allies because a lot of people just really were not exposed to anything about Native American history or cultures. And I do see that starting to shift a bit with the upcoming generations. I'm hearing fewer students who get to classes in college who say, oh, I've never had a lesson on Native Americans. Or, my teacher told me they were all dead and gone. That's becoming rarer. And it used to be quite common. So I do see a lot of hope in that. I'm hearing more students who actually do know of some Indigenous communities near them, or they grew up and knew of one of their friends who were Indigenous, which probably also means that young Indigenous kids are being more confident to come out and say, no, I'm part of this nation. This is, part of who I am. And it means that they're maybe even more validated by teachers and schools when they say that. So my hope is that when we do something like this and people actually get involved, they start learning more, that in the future, those become our allies. So when they hear about something that's going on 3 towns over, a very reasonable request from an Indigenous group there saying, this is our land and we actually don't want this 3 acres to be clear cut. We want to preserve it. There's wildlife here. Maybe they get behind that. Maybe they actually come out to an event or they write to a senator instead of necessarily believing something that they hear in the news. Maybe they look into it a little deeper. Maybe this helps them remember to do the research on Indigenous people and what they're really asking for.
Is your what's your opinion on kind of where congressional leadership is on caring about Indigenous people's issues and getting involved to help out there?
Well, I will say I don't think it's ever been awesome.
Yeah.
There's never a time period I could point to where I was like, this was really when Congress really cared about Indigenous people a lot. I think it's always an uphill battle because in a lot of Indigenous communities, there's not a ton of money. That's not every community, but a lot of communities, because of very real historical issues, have not been allowed to engage in business, have not been encouraged to seek higher education, have been actively discouraged from things like that. And I think that that's what talks in a lot of political circles.
Yeah.
But I'm hoping that we get some more people who are at least reasonably informed about who Indigenous people are. I do think tribal rights are a mystery to most people who are in politics. I don't think that most people in Congress could describe to me where a tribal nation's laws fit in among federal and state law. I would be very surprised if 5 could do it.
Yeah. Is that too broad-ranging of a topic to get into here? I'm really curious. I think people probably are hearing you say that, and people listening to this don't even know where tribal rights fit in the context of federal and state law. So I'm wondering if you could just talk as briefly or as long as you want to about that, because I think people may truly have no idea.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And if listeners don't know, that's forgivable because they're not in Congress.
Yeah. Although I'm hoping we do have some congressional listeners, and if we do, shame on you.
Shame. And listen, and I'll tell you a little bit about it.
Yeah.
So when a tribal nation puts land in reserve, that's the creation of a reservation, then that land becomes a federal reserve. So it is beholden to federal law, not state law. It's basically like having a state within a state. Okay. It's almost equal to the state, except if anything, it's a little bit more powerful than the state, at least in theory. States, of course, hate this because it means that items can be sold on that reservation without a state sales tax. Mm-hmm. It also allows things like gaming. So most people think that gaming is something that Indigenous people have as some kind of ethnic right. It's not that at all. To have gaming, you have to have land in federal trust status, which means that you can have gaming because, of course, there's no federal law against gaming. That's how places like Nevada has it. The purpose behind putting land into federal trust for Indigenous people, there were several reasons that the U.S. government decided to do this. On the one hand, they thought that the states were taking advantage of Indigenous people too much, and that they were kind of using methods to cheat them out of their land, which was true. On the other hand, it had to be put in federal trust, the government felt, because Indigenous people could not be trusted to manage their own land. They felt that they weren't used to a capitalist system and that they would have to be gradually introduced to it. Throughout various periods in history, the U.S. government has tried to undo and redo this policy. There was a time where they broke up all of these federally managed chunks of reservation land. They gave individual parcels. This was to discourage Native Americans from actually being a tribal nation, from having land in community, right? And having community fields. That was almost seen as communistic. So they wanted to encourage this nuclear family capitalist design. And they did it in an extremely racialized way. So they would actually visit with different Native Americans and look at them and try to determine how racially mixed they were. And if you were, as they saw it, mixed with white, then you got more land. If you were what they thought was 100% Native American, you got the medium amount of land. And if you were mixed with African heritage, you got the least amount of land. And they did this on site so much so that you could have 3 siblings who got different land parcels based on their racial designation. Same parents.
Why did I ask?
Different skin tones.
Why did I ask? I should have known.
We need to know.
I know, but I'm just.
People need to know these.
No,
things.
I know.
I mean, like I think about. Sorry.
No, don't apologize.
Like I'm so naive, and I can like say that out loud, but like, like we used to travel around the country every year. My parents would take us on like a minivan adventure, and we've been to different parts of the country. So, the most representation I've ever seen of Native Americans is in the Southwest, because there's so much of it down there. But like, I think about the Northeast, and I don't think, you think of like Mohegan, and like, you don't really like, where are these people? They've been driven so far underground. Like, you don't even know like where they are. And I feel so naive, like I remember when we took the kids down to Mohegan, we took our son down. No, we took both of them down there to go see like Cirque du Soleil or something. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And we were trying to explain to them, like, we're not in America right now. Like, we're on like Native American land. Like, we were trying to explain the difference. We probably did a terrible job, like listening to you talk about it. I'm like, we did a terrible job explaining this to them.
Well, trying to apply what I think I just heard, and help me out here, Virginia. I'm sure I may say this wrong, but so Native American nation states are still part of the United States. They're just not part of the state they reside in.
Interesting question. So up until the 1800s, they were considered the same as foreign nations. So that's the treaty era, where a Native group would make a treaty with the U.S. government just as Italy or France would. And it was actually in relation to my tribal group that this changed. So the Cherokee were trying to fight the Indian Removal Act, which eventually led to the Trail of Tears. And they tried to bring this case as Indigenous people to the Supreme Court. But at the time, it was ruled that they could not bring this case to the Supreme Court because they were not citizens. No Native Americans were citizens for a very long time. And it was also ruled that they could not bring it directly to Congress because they were not really a foreign nation. The judge at the time made up a new term, and he said they are a domestic dependent sovereign nation. And that's a term that had never been used before in law, and he completely invented it, and threw their case out and said the Supreme Court could not hear it. Later, they actually had a white missionary, Samuel Worcester, who was a 7th generation member of the same family that established Worcester, Mass. Mm-hmm. He was a missionary, and to really prove that this was not about civilizing the Cherokee, as they originally said, the state of Georgia threatened to arrest all missionaries working within the Cherokee territories. And he was arrested on purpose, served many months in a very horrible Georgia prison. And then when he got out, he took the case as a white man to the Supreme Court, arguing basically the same point as the Cherokee, that the state of Georgia does not have any say over Cherokee lands, which the Supreme Court agreed with. They won the case through Samuel Worcester, and then they were removed anyway, in spite of that.
And now I'm lying. Because the town I grew up in was Manalapan, because it was which was a Native American, because the Lenni Lenape lived in the region that I lived, that I grew up in New Jersey.
And it sounds like,
and I knew that, and our school mascot was the Braves.
Oh, geez.
I'm just like, I don't know. God.
That kind of, and thank you for that explanation.
So messed up.
No, I feel like it clarified some of my misperceptions around.
I know, but I just like have so many like
the legal structure.
Yeah.
So I want to think about the iShape program and some of the resources in there to help educate people. A lot, if not all of them, are from Indigenous people, or certainly from the. Most of them are from Indigenous people, right? They're resources that books, videos, music, or that were developed by Indigenous people. Am I right about that?
Yes, absolutely. We intentionally made sure all the books and all the podcasts are by Indigenous people. And then most of the videos are as well, or they heavily feature Indigenous people. So there might be something from, say, BuzzFeed, but it's where they interview 30 Native American people on a subject. So it's primarily featuring Indigenous voices.
And so how do and this may seem like an obvious question, but how do non-Indigenous people in our communities benefit from engaging with these resources that are developed by Indigenous people?
I think it's going to give a very different perspective on who Indigenous people are, especially if you've been seeing Indigenous people in things that are produced by non-Indigenous people. So you're going to get, first of all, a lot more of a specific view. So a lot of these resources are actually from the Northeast. So they might talk about not just Native Americans, but specifically Mohawk people, specifically Aquinnah-Wampanoag people, specifically Nipmuc people. So that in itself, I think, is really different. We talk about Native Americans as a group a lot, but every group is unique, actually. And so a lot of these books and videos will talk about what it means not only to be Native American, but also to have this very specific tribal and even clan designation, because there are clans within almost each Indigenous group as well.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting point, right? When people think about Native Americans, right, they think about kind of a homogeneous culture, right, or homogeneous type of people. One of the things that I learned, and this shouldn't be a surprise to me, right, but I'm not that bright. But one of the things I learned from one of our guests, Jason Montgomery, who has Mexican ancestry, he was talking to us a little bit about Mexican, the diversity of indigenous cultural populations across Mexico.
California.
I'm thinking specifically about Mexico, though, about how there are hundreds and hundreds of very distinct, unique, indigenous cultures across Mexico that are, as different from each other as planets are different from each other. Like he was telling us a little bit about that, and I think people may not realize that here in our part of North America, north of Mexico up to Canada, that there's probably a similar diversity of indigenous cultures. I don't know. Is my perception of that accurate?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's really interesting. The more you live in a place, the more you really start to see these unique differences, even in things as simple as kind of aesthetic design. The type of beadwork that's done, or particular motifs that occur over and over again in paintings and in work with like birch bark. So I think that, people won't have to come out of this knowing every detail of every group in their area, but I think it would be interesting for people just to see, hey, I'm surrounded by all these cool, unique cultural groups. I could actually visit them, maybe once COVID's over. At some point, I might be able to go to an event. I might be able to see some of these things. You might even be able to meet some of the people who are in these videos or writing these books. They're fixtures in the community. Most of these authors and the people in the videos are living people. You can go to their restaurants. You can meet them at a museum. They're going to be at powwows. They might be dancing in the circle. It's actually very accessible.
I think some people might, be afraid to, or feel like they wouldn't be welcome, like at those types of events or places. I'm thinking, about a powwow. Are those types of events, do they tend to be open for people from an educational perspective, like to go and attend and learn? Can you talk a little bit about that? Like if somebody does see something like advertised in the paper or online, do people read papers anymore? Should they feel welcome to attend something like that?
They should absolutely feel welcome to attend. And I think a lot of Indigenous people hope that they're going to get non-Indigenous people there so they can actually share some knowledge with them, so they can actually start to build those friendships and allyships. If you go to a powwow, you'll often hear the MC, who is the person who does all the announcing. He or she, or they might explain what's going on, specifically with an eye towards people who might not know. So you'll see, girls come up in these dresses that have jingles attached to them. And the MC, instead of just saying, all right, jingle dress dancers line up, they might give a little background on what jingle dress is, what the dance stands for, the fact that it's the type of prayer. It's actually a form of prayer and healing. And so they'll give a little background, and then they'll have people come out and dance. And there's usually dances where everyone is allowed to come in, and they'll kind of tell you what to do. So even if you know nothing, even if you're a terrible dancer, you can join the circle with all of the people who are there doing these, kind of hard to learn dances, right? The indigenous dancers of the day. But they'll say, everyone come into the circle, everyone's welcome. And you get to be part of these really cool dances. Some of them actually form kind of spirals, and then they kind of unwind the spiral. It's really neat. They have dances for kids, and they're fun. And the hope is that people will come out. I heard one indigenous person once say, if it's a private event, don't worry about it. You won't ever hear about it. If you've heard about it, that means it's public and you're welcome to come.
Okay. You might like that, Stomping Jen. The dancing. You like dancing. We should go to one. A powwow.
Sorry.
I don't like dancing.
He hates
I can't dance. I get very uncomfortable. But then when I start dancing, I feel okay. It's like that initial, starting to dance. It's really difficult for me.
All right.
But once I get over that,
all right,
I'm okay. So I'm trying to think about resources, books. Is there anything that stands out in your mind as must read or must watch in terms of education about indigenous peoples or cultures? Do you have a go-to book or documentary or film that you recommend to people?
Gosh, there are so many, and I've been kind of pouring them into this project as well. So every recommendation I have is somewhere in one of these weeks. I do like an Indigenous Peoples History of the United States, and that is on there, as well as the youth version that was printed. I think that one's great. One film that I don't know if we've put it on yet. It might be in a later week of iShape, Massachusetts. But I do love the film Reel Engine. It's spelled REEL, so film reel. And it gets into the stereotypes of Native Americans and how they were formed by Hollywood. And it kind of picks them apart, but in a humorous way. So they'll have comedians who are Indigenous and filmmakers who are Indigenous. And then they also show an updated version of kind of what's going on in Indigenous created media today, which is really interesting and fun and cool. And yeah, those are two that I always go to. I've read and watched them both many times.
Yeah, this just popped into my head. We went to the Native American History Museum in Washington, D.C. a few years back. And they have this multiple room, exhibit hall
it's of
stereotypes of Native Americans, and I think
in pop culture and advertising.
Yeah, in advertising and popular culture. Have you seen that? Have you been down there?
Yes, I have. It was several years ago, but I have seen that.
Yeah, I was horrified by it. It was, I don't know. It was so overwhelming to me. And there's something about the construction of the exhibit, having it all there, kind of in your face, and you realize how pervasive, the stereotypes are in popular culture and in advertising, that I don't know. That just stopped me in my tracks. Mm-hmm. Because the way they design it, it's
floor to ceiling.
It's floor to ceiling, and it's got to be 100-foot walls, and it's as far as the eye can see. I don't know if that's an intentional thing to overwhelm you with it, but yeah, and for me, maybe that's popping into my mind because I'm juxtaposing against the importance of people being exposed to media and resources that, depict Indigenous people in an accurate,
authentic light, as opposed to
in an accurate and culturally sensitive way.
right.
So, and I will tell people I'm linking to those resources in our podcast show notes, so you can go find those there if you're listening to this. One thing I also wanted to ask about is one goal of the program is to help support Indigenous business owners, activists, educators, and artists. How can people find all of those aforementioned individuals? Like, if I want to support Indigenous business owners and artists, like how do I go about doing that?
It's a great question. We're putting together the links to everyone who we're purchasing from and who's donating. But I think most of the Indigenous artists, they're just straight purchasing their pieces to give out in the giveaway at the end. But if you look at those week to weeks, I think in the kind of over 19, adult section for grownups, there'll be links to places where you can shop. So local artists, as well as kind of these national web pages that feature Indigenous artists from all over the United States, some from the Northeast, but some from other places as well. So we're putting those links in. And of course, no pressure on anyone to actually go buy anything if you're unable to. But it's really cool just to even look around and do some online window shopping just to see the really cool artwork that's being produced by Indigenous people in every type of aesthetic you can imagine.
Yeah, and people, the holidays are coming up, so you can go look on there for maybe some interesting non-Amazon union busting gifts. So go check those out, definitely. Virginia, so we mentioned, I think, earlier in the podcast that you're an anthropologist. You have a master's degree in this. You're working on a PhD. Your master's thesis was, I'm going to read this, stereotypes of contemporary Native American Indian characters in recent popular media. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? I don't know if it's right to call that a study or an analysis, but about that thesis and your interest in that topic in particular.
Absolutely. That title really rolls off the tongue, doesn't it?
I am going to read it, by the way, and I'm going to put the link to your to the Scholar Works where people can find that and read it. Also in the podcast notes, so they can look at that.
Oh, great! Thank you.
And read it. Sure. Yep.
Yeah, that was a study I did because I was wondering about issues that young Indigenous people had. And at the time, a lot of Indigenous people were kind of leaning towards this, not being recognized as Indigenous and the fact that it bothered them. At the same time, I kept hearing from a lot of academic works and just people on the street this idea that you don't see Native Americans in contemporary set shows, right? You only see them in these historicals, these Westerns. And yet, every time a Native American character would come on a show like Bones or Criminal Minds, I would get like 3 texts from various family members and friends. Did you see the Native American on Bones? So I'm like, they're out there. I know, because I keep getting these texts every time CBS airs an episode with a Native American person on it. Everyone hits me up to say, did you see it? So I started to think, well, what are people getting? Just your average person who sits down to TV. This was kind of before the age of streaming really took over. So there were still people watching local channels and national channels. And I thought, what episodes are they seeing? What are they getting from these really popular shows? What impression of Indigenous people? And so I started kind of just collecting from 1990 on. 2012 was when it was published. I collected a little bit further than that, actually. I've got the spreadsheet still running. Mm-hmm. And then I just obsessively watched every episode of every TV show that I could find, every movie, and read every popular book, and that includes Twilight. Every word. I've read every word of Twilight. And
can I ask, did you watch Star Trek Voyager?
I did, although technically that's not contemporary, it's the future.
Oh, right. Shame on me.
So I didn't put it in, but
Crickets.
I wanted to.
Sorry. I forgot. That is the future. Yes.
Future.
Yep. Okay.
Props to them for putting an Indigenous character in the future. I mean, it wasn't perfect, but it was ahead of its time.
Yeah. Sorry, I interrupted you. So you did read Twilight. Every word of that. Yep.
I did for my thesis.
Yep.
But then I made this gigantic spreadsheet where I just started putting in every kind of aspect, every personality quirk, every geographical thing, everything associated with Indigenous people and not associated with them that I could possibly think of that appeared in any episode of any show, and then started cross-checking to see where they overlapped. And I did a bunch of different variations of this, and I looked at it chronologically, and that didn't really produce much, apart from the fact that the Washington State area was real popular in the early 1990s, because that's where Twin Peaks was set, and it's where they filmed Northern Exposure. And then it got popular again around Twilight. So that wasn't really much. That was just more about production and where production was being held. And then I looked north to south. It's a real historical, in the United States, north and south is usually kind of juxtaposed against each other. That didn't produce anything. But then east to west produced huge trends. So certain columns just lit up only for the east and not at all for the west, and vice versa. So that's when I thought something really weird is happening with the portrayals. And there has been this historic divide between the Indigenous people east of the Mississippi, who were thought to be kind of wiped out through King Philip's War and through the Indian Removal Act, and these, Trails of Tears west, and then western kind of more plains Indigenous people, who are considered more authentic, who have been considered to have lasted longer. All of this is, not the greatest, most accurate history, because of course there's still tons of Indigenous people east of the Mississippi. But in every portrayal of them, they were often portrayed as racially mixed. They were given accents that very clearly belonged to other ethnic groups, like Italian American accents, French accents, these kind of jabs at their identity that maybe they're not fully Indigenous, maybe they're not really Native American. In many episodes, they had Indigenous characters just come right out and say, "Oh, I'm faking it." And just over and over again, you see this. So it all kind of coincides with this popular history that there are no real Native Americans out here anymore. The false idea that Native Americans get all kinds of benefits that other people don't get. And so there's good reason to fake it. In a lot of the Eastern set shows, they've lost their spirituality, they're shysters, they're crooked. If they try to do a prayer, it fails. Whereas in the West, they're portrayed as much more authentic, but also hostile to outsiders. They're always, moody. They don't want to talk to the white main characters. They try to kick them off the reservation. They're covered in face paint. There's a lot of shape-shifting, a lot of associations with these mystical happenings. They can see ghosts. I mean, just anything you can think of that's mystical and magical that's happening out there in the West in these TV shows. So it was an interesting divide to see that in pop culture and to see it as such a huge trend set.
Did your study venture into trying to explain that difference, like why there was a difference in interpretation between the East and the West when it came to those representations?
I did. So I looked really at history books to see what they were saying about the East and West, and it focused really on this extermination idea for the East. And that has been played out through a lot of different things. I mentioned the Mashpee Wampanoag's court case from the 1970s on land. They lost that case because one of the reasons listed by the all non-Indigenous jury is that they were too racially mixed. So there was still this idea in the 1970s that at some point, if you lost enough Indian blood, quote unquote, you were not really considered Native American. Almost the exact opposite of the one drop rule for being considered African American.
Huh. That's interesting. I don't know what I think about it. It's just interesting. Now, your PhD, your doctoral studies, are you continuing that work you started with your master's thesis, or are you going in a different direction? What's your area of focus there? A
slightly different direction. After studying those stereotypical kind of things for so long. And I did do a really large study too of the historical stereotypes. At that point, I kind of wanted to move on and look at what Indigenous people are producing about themselves and saying about themselves. So now I'm looking at Native American produced digital media, including online websites, communities, and things like that, just to see what differences exist. And there are some, as you can imagine, pretty huge ones that exist between what non-Indigenous people and the mainstream portray as Indigenous versus what Indigenous people themselves are saying about themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I think you talked about this a little bit up at the front of the podcast. I think I probably know the answer, but I'll ask the question anyways. Why did you decide you wanted to be an anthropologist or do this work in anthropology? Is it tied to your identity as a Indigenous person, or do you also have a kind of an external interest in anthropology?
So I think it is tied to my identity. And at first, I just saw anthropology as the vehicle that would allow me to do work with all kinds of Indigenous communities and to do some kind of good work in undoing the stereotypes that I had grown up with and that other Indigenous people I met in college had also grown up with. I did not at the time when I first got into it. I took one anthropology class. The professor was incredible. That was Dr. Scott Lacey at Emory. And he was so inspirational with what he was doing. He saw anthropology as service. And he basically said, you're getting your entire career from studying and living amongst a group of people, generally being a pain in the neck to them because you don't understand what's happening around you most of the time when you start. So you should do something back for them. This should be something that actually gives back. You should be in service. I really love that. So I jumped into it. And as I learned more about anthropology, it has, like many academic disciplines, a pretty sordid history with Indigenous communities. But there have also always been Indigenous anthropologists as well. People who are coming into the field to correct those mistakes and to kind of give a different perspective. So I hope that I'm following in their footsteps.
Has anything surprised you about becoming an anthropologist? Did anything you weren't expecting, or kind of curious about that?
Yeah, I don't know. The work alongside biological anthropologists, because they were the group that has probably the most conflict over history with Indigenous communities. So I know even in the 1990s, there were biological anthropologists who were very unwilling to let go of collections of Native American skeletons and remains and sacred objects. And they were being told by the 1990 Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act that you need to give these things back. If you can identify where they were stolen from, in most of the cases stolen, then they should return back to those people. And some were very hesitant to do this. And so when I got into anthropology, I expected a lot of biological anthropologists to not be sensitive to Native American issues. And this is a very pleasant surprise that I think the work of NAGPRA, being a law that kind of really intends to set right those wrongs of anthropology in the past, it has become part of the culture of many biological anthropologists. I've had so much respect from them, and I have so much respect for them. The ones I've worked with have gone out of their way, bent over backwards to make sure that they are adhering to Indigenous protocol. And that might not be the experience for everyone or for every Indigenous person or every anthropologist. But for me, I've actually gotten along very well with some of the bio-anth people. And they've really tried to correct some of the wrongs of anthropology's history.
Yeah, and I would imagine that, I was going to say, it's never easy to change the rules, right? And that must have been very difficult for them, I'm thinking. But also, like, in my mind, like, who are you to think you get to hold on to somebody's body, and ignore any particular cultural sensitivities around the possession of those remains. But on the other hand, they also, I think, like they might, and I'm speaking way out of my realm of expertise, but my thought would be they might play a very important role in telling the anthropological story of Indigenous people. Is there like, how do you work out now, like, if remains are found or discovered, and like a biological anthropologist wants to, I don't know if I'm using the right words, like sample that, like how do you work that out, like procedurally, like let the biological anthropologists get the information that they need to contribute to the field of study, but also be respectful. Like, are there now widely agreed upon protocols for that, or is it, like, curious about that?
There's no widely agreed upon protocols, and I think the situation varies, from discovery to discovery. In many cases, most of the time, the remains we're talking about were from the past. They've been in museums for a long time. When there's a new discovery, that can be very tricky because it's not always super clear from the objects around the person what group they may have belonged to, right? Some indigenous people have spiritual ways of identifying their own ancestors. And while that may seem, too unscientific to some people, I will say that in many cases they've been correct. And they've been verified later by DNA testing. But in many cases, tribal groups don't want DNA testing because that's an invasive procedure with these very old remains. And they take very seriously not disturbing the remains.
Yeah.
There are many spiritual beliefs around it. But in some groups, it's not as taboo a thing to do. There have been tribes that have allowed archaeologists and biological anthropologists to look at remains that were already unearthed through construction and things like that, as long as they are minimalistic with their invasive procedures, kind of help tell the story of those individuals and then promise to reinter them. So that does happen from time to time, those kind of arrangements. And in that case, I think, having those good relationships with anthropologists that are trustworthy, who will actually, adhere to what the tribe is wanting, is really important. And in other cases, when they don't want it done, they should be left alone.
Yeah. Thinking, kind of shifting back to popular media, are there representations of Native American characters in popular media that stand out to you as being particularly negative or damaging?
There's many that have struck me over the years. I think I was really hurt when I saw the episode of, it was a Bugs Bunny cartoon where he was shooting at Native Americans and he was doing hash marks for the count of how many he had shot.
Oh my God.
And then he shot one of them and said, oh, that one was just a half breed. And he erased half of the hash mark he had just drawn. And that one,
God,
that hurt my feelings. I liked Bugs Bunny as a kid.
Yeah, Looney Tunes.
Well, I'm thinking we have two kids now, are 13 and 10, and back like 7 years ago, their grandparents bought them the Looney Tunes box set. And I still remember, like, some of those cartoons are so bad they had to put a disclaimer up at the front of the disc, like explaining that these are representations, of a time and a place, and don't, blah, 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 represent our values now. Thinking about that, I'm kind of curious, like, do you think that's the right way to handle something like that? Like, is it Warner Brothers, like, put a big disclaimer on the front saying, look, this is objectively culturally insensitive, it's objectively wrong, we're going to tell you that it's wrong, and that these things represent, values from a time and a place that aren't now. Is that the right approach? Or, but, because they're making money off of that still, right? Like, what is the right approach? I'm curious if you have an opinion on that.
Yeah, I think, first of all, it's a lot better than when they used to just air them. So I'm glad that there's progress on that front. I know Disney is doing the same thing with a lot of their shows. And I do want some of these to be made available as teaching tools. Yeah. Because I do want to show, hey, I think if we erase it all, people say, well, why are Native Americans so upset with how they've been portrayed? And I think you have to point back to things like that for people to go, ooh, that is bad.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's helpful to show people that, older people, not little kids. But I think when kids get older, you can show them that and they know, oh, that's bad. At the same time, I do think that the economic aspect is problematic. I would like for the sales of things like that to actually, a portion of it to go back to the communities who were hurt by it in the first place. I think that would be an ideal and very lovely thing for these companies to do who have been profiting off of those stereotypes for so long.
Yeah, and let me guess, they're not donating in a significant way. That's my guess.
Looney Tunes, you mean Warner Brothers?
Yeah, don't sue us, Warner Brothers, if you are. If you are, let us know about it, please.
Yes.
So kind of thinking on the other side of that, are there any representations in popular media that stand out to you as having got it right or mostly right, or are things that you've watched and you say as an Indigenous person, I feel good about that?
Yeah, a lot of Indigenous created stuff I really quite like. Molly of Denali is a PBS show. It's actually out of Canada, but it's about an Inuit girl, and that one is really, really well done. She's a very normal girl. She's not portrayed as super exotic, but she's also portrayed as having her Indigenous identity be a part of her everyday life and something that she does. And almost every person I talk to who's Inuit or even who's from a different Indigenous group says, wow, I feel really represented having her on television. So I've known grown people who watched that show and cried because they were so happy that, other little girls would have that. So that one is definitely in our resources as something for kids to watch. And there's some games for them to play online, particularly during this pandemic time when there's not so much to do outside of the home. Mm-hmm. I think that one was a really good one. I also am a huge fan of Taika Waititi, and he's not Native American. He's Maori from New Zealand, and he's become quite a big name in Hollywood after directing Jojo Rabbit and Thor Ragnarok. He's put all kinds of little Indigenous nods into Thor Ragnarok for those who can spot them. Oh.
What's that movie, Hunt for the Wilder People?
Yeah, that's such a good movie.
Yes.
I love that movie.
Yeah.
I love Taika Waititi. He's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I love that he, a lot of Indigenous created stuff for a period focused so much on the historical trauma that was really important to cover. It was important that people know about it. Rhymes for Young Ghouls is a great movie that does that, kind of a spooky, creepy, almost Halloweenish vibe to it, but it looks at the residential boarding schools, some of this really traumatic history. And while these are really great movies and you should watch them, at a certain point as an Indigenous person, I cannot watch another sad movie about Native people where everything's terrible and wrong. Mm-hmm. And it's not a great reflection on what day-to-day life is for many Indigenous people. There's ups and downs for sure with every community and every individual. But I kind of like the joy that's infused through Taika Waititi's movies and the humor, because humor is huge in so many Indigenous communities, and I just like to see it on film.
How does humor play out in Indigenous communities? Not that you can paint all Indigenous communities with one brush and say, but I'm curious if there are examples you can think of. Are there Indigenous stand-up comedians? Are there, I don't know, help me out, Stomping Jen.
I don't know where you're going with this.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm just curious if you can think of just examples of how humor plays like an important role.
Yeah, I can't give specific examples, I don't think, without getting people in bad trouble with elders.
Okay, yeah, don't do that, please.
But even some of our elders are pretty funny. Just remembering back to one elder in particular, and she would just kind of rate the young men dancing in the circle. Mm-hmm. And she would just look at me and be like, now he's good looking. If I was 40 years younger, I'd have my eyes on him. Now the guy beside him, I don't like what he's got going on. I don't like the thing he's doing with his hair. I mean, just brazenly and full volume, by the way, everyone could hear. So she was just objectifying these poor young men. But she wasn't being serious, and they all knew her and took it very well. But you'll hear people even around the drum, while the drum is sacred, the guys will be cutting up, the women will be cutting up, and sometimes have to be told when they were called to drum. Mm-hmm. Someone will have to say, hey, you're on. And then they're, oh, and jump into the song. People will have to elbow each other sometimes during a song to keep on track. Generally, it's just kind of a good time. I don't remember too many trips to powwows in cars that didn't involve a whole lot of people packed into a car and people laughing and telling jokes the whole time.
Yeah, and I do like your focus on appreciating those elements like of Indigenous culture, because I think you're right. I'm thinking of the representations that stand out in my mind, and they're often like grim, like reservation type scenarios, and not just like you said, like they don't typically include like those joyous elements that are part of everybody's day-to-day lives. Bringing this back to the iShape program, as a scholar, as an Indigenous person and a member of, this Western Massachusetts community we live in, what has being involved in developing this program and supporting it and getting it out there to the world meant to you?
It's been a great opportunity for one to try and get some of this information out and to try and get it out to people at a young age, because often, by the time people get to college, it's a lot of work sometimes to undo some of the things they've learned that weren't accurate, or just to make them aware that Indigenous people are around. And by that time, they also, like you said, they might feel a little intimidated coming to an event like a powwow. Or they say, I don't know anything, or I don't know anything about Native Americans, which, first of all, you can come even if you don't know anything. You'll learn there, you'll meet people, and people will be friendly and invite you in. But hopefully, people would feel more comfortable if they had some exposure when they were really little. So they grow up kind of knowing, at least in the back of their head, there's Indigenous people all around. They might not look like some of the cartoons I've seen, right? They might look just like me. Mm-hmm. And they have these concerns and they have these political rights. Yeah. And so hopefully that builds a better future. And for me, it's also been so positive to see that young people who aren't Indigenous actually do care about our communities, actually do want to be allies and kind of build towards this better future where we're all in this together.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's great. So people, go check out the program, right? I don't think it's too late to sign up for it, right? I mean, when people hear this, it will be the week of November 18th. And, can people still, as they're listening to this, can they still go on and like sign up for it and look at some of the materials?
They can, and they can even look at previous weeks and do those activities.
Okay.
So every activity, whether it's reading a book or even watching a 5-minute video, comes with little points that you earn. And you can then cash those points in for prizes. And so if you're, joining us in the last week, but you really want to go back and read about Columbus Day and Indigenous Peoples Day and the issues around that, go back and do those activities and, earn your points and maybe even get some really cool Indigenous art at the end of it.
Yeah, and I just want to mention that again. There's going to be over $500 worth of prizes that is going to be given out that were purchased from Indigenous artists, creators, and business owners. So, and you can go on to the iShape website and take a look at I think there's an Instagram of some of the artwork and prizes, and they're beautiful. So you can take a look at those. Yeah, and what I'd say is I was looking through some of the questions and some of the materials, and some of them really got me thinking, right? And I felt really were challenging me. Like, I think there was one question about think about a representation of an Indigenous person you've seen in the media. Like I had to sit down and really think about that. Like, and I couldn't think of anything like current. And I think that probably speaks to something, right? I don't know what exactly, probably the degree of representation. But then the thing that popped into my mind was Dances with Wolves, like that movie from 1991. Like, why is that the thing that's stuck in my head? And like, I know I've seen.
You love Kevin Costner.
I do love
Let's say it's
Kevin.
Kevin Costner.
I do love. We have to have a man crush episode at a different time, but I do love him. But and I think he's a great actor. By the way, he's not only handsome; he is a great actor. But
I didn't say he was handsome.
I said it. Leave me alone. So no, my point is, it's like that. That is the popular culture representation of Indigenous people that like came into my head when I sat down to think about it. And part of me was like, shame on you, like to me, because I know there's so many probably other ones. But anyways, I don't want to try to unpack that here about like why that is but anyways, like there's a
program.
Yep, the iShape program. There's a lot in there to really help engage you and challenge you and really
reframe your education.
Really get you to think about Indigenous people in our community and beyond. Yep. So I definitely want to recommend people check that out. And as Virginia said, it doesn't matter that the program started a few weeks back. You can get in there and engage with the materials.
Will it be available after the date too? Like for people to jump in, like maybe they don't win the prizes, but they can still work their way through the curriculum?
Yeah, I believe it is going to stay up. And I think the goal of the Belchertown Justice Collaborative is to do this again in the future, and to keep this as broad as possible so that if you're not in Belchertown, that's fine. You can do it, in any other place around the Northeast, and it will still be really relevant. You could do it really anywhere in the country and it would still be relevant to learn about some of these historical things. Yeah.
All right. So we're just going to end with 2 questions we like to ask people. They're kind of fun questions. So we want to end on a fun note. A fun note, Stomping Jen.
This has all been fun.
It has been, absolutely. But these are the heavy. These are under a section called fun on my notes. So
the fun section.
Yeah.
All right. What's your question?
Okay. Virginia, what do you like to do for fun when you're not working? So when you're not, but I'm getting a sense that anthropology might be fun for you. But so let's set aside when you're not doing anthropology and you're not doing your day job. What do you like to do to entertain yourself, unwind,
self-care.
whatever it is?
Yeah.
God, I can go on forever here. I am an arts and crafts fanatic. So I do beadwork and I paint and I crochet and I do resin work and I repaint 1960s creepy blow mold, which are those things that you put in your yard that light up from the inside that look vaguely haunted.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I repaint those.
That's amazing.
What's a blow?
She just told us.
No, I know she did, but I can't in my mind picture what that looks like.
Have you seen those plastic things that have like lights on the inside of them and it'll be like a Santa, but he looks really creepy?
Oh.
Yeah, like those translucent kind of like, they're not the inflatable fabric ones, but the plastic like translucent-y. I'm a child of the 70s and early 80s, so I know exactly what you're talking about. I'm 6 years old.
You've been haunted by them your whole life, then.
You're not 6 years older than me.
How much older am
4.
I? Oh, sorry.
What are you talking about?
I know what you're talking about, and I think that's awesome. Although, I'm not sure you're helping the world by restoring those things, because they are creepy.
That sounds like what she does.
Okay, so what else do you do?
Speaking of creepy, I love... not true crime, because that's too scary to me if something actually happened, but a murder mystery I love. And I've collected so many that my husband says it looks like I'm planning something.
Oh, no.
It's looking bad.
Yeah. Well, that's cool. Mm-hmm. Okay, last question. And this is the best question, I think. And you can... God. So you can interpret this any way you want. Okay. You have full license to do that. What have you seen that you cannot explain? I'm going to play some creepy music.
Don't play the creepy music.
Yes, play the creepy music. I did, and this is going to sound a little cuckoo.
Okay.
But as a kid, I lived in the middle of the woods, and I did see an aircraft over me moving so slowly but I followed it through the woods and could remain directly underneath it. And it was V-shaped and had 5 lights in a V. And I'm guessing it was some kind of government flight because we were right in an area where they would test planes. We used to have them break the sound barrier over us and it would shake the entire house. I nearly died chewing on a gobstopper once because of that.
Oh my God.
Really traumatic episode in my life. So I'm guessing that this was some kind of test that they were running, but it was really late at night. It was, like 11 or midnight. And I walked underneath this thing for quite some time.
Stomping Jen, do you know what we have just heard?
What?
Virginia, I have talked on this podcast many times about what I believe are to be extraterrestrial aircraft that are visiting our planet. Our own government has confirmed this.
He's obsessed with this.
Early in the summer, the Department of Defense released 2 videos recorded by F-15 fighter jets. Are you familiar with this at all?
Yes, I saw those.
I think I have found another guest to appear on my upcoming UFO episode, Stomping Jen. I love that you shared that with us. Thank you, Virginia.
Oh my God.
I appreciate it.
Oh, and so I
Yes.
looked up these blow modes. They all seem to be like holiday related. Is that true? They're all like holiday related.
They are. If you see a Halloween one, let me know because those are rare.
Yeah, there were some jack-o'-lantern ones that I found.
Oh, online?
I mean,
Are they
really
recreations?
quickly just to see to give myself some context.
Okay.
I just looked it up real quick.
Those are great. They're
All right.
mostly Christmas related, like winter related.
Yeah.
Yeah. I like a creepy Santa myself.
Yeah. Cool.
All right. Well, Virginia, I cannot thank you enough for coming on and talking to us about the Belchertown Justice Collaborative's iShape program, about your anthropological studies. I learned a lot. That was really informative for me.
Yeah.
I hope
I'm
other
sorry
people...
I spewed out
Well, listen, times are tough, Stomping Jen.
I know.
You're fine.
Yeah.
You're fine.
Thank you.
So what we want to say to our listeners is go check this stuff out, right?
Yeah.
I looked at it for about an hour and I was intrigued. I'm going to go back to it. I'm going to look at it. To our listeners, we also want to say thank you for listening.
Yes. Thank you.
You are the lifeblood of the podcast. Right? Stomping Jen.
That's true.
So we appreciate you.
Yeah, we love you.
We love you. Next week will be our Thanksgiving episode. We'll be doing that.
Yeah.
Right?
Everyone should wear a mask.
Right?
Be safe.
Yeah.
They've already voted.
That's right. They've already voted. So still wear your mask, though.
Yes.
Right?
Continue to wear your mask.
Okay.
Okay.
Virginia, any final words as we go out of the podcast?
Just want to say thank you for having me on. And I want to thank the Belchertown Justice Collaborative for putting this event together, for shaping this, and for bringing so many interesting things for people to explore. So I really encourage people to get on there at any time of year and look at these.
Thank you.
Well said. Thanks, everybody. Again, we love you. Thanks for listening, and we will see you later, right?
Yep.
Okay. Bye now.
Bye now.
Good evening, my fellow Americans. America knows that this world of ours, ever growing smaller, must avoid becoming a community of dreadful fear and hate. Those who have freedom will understand also its heavy responsibility. That all who are insensitive to the needs of others will learn charity, and that the sources, scourges of poverty, disease, and ignorance will be made disappear from the earth. And that in the goodness of time, all peoples will come to live together in a peace guaranteed